This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Family Business Atlantic's Staying Connected webinar series. I'm Amine Musabi, the president of Family Business Atlantic. For those on the line who may not be so familiar with our association, we connect and support families in business, small and medium enterprises, and entrepreneurs to help drive the Atlantic economy. We offer safe and confidential forums for members to share their business challenges with and learn from peer groups. We also provide a lot of programming platforms like this with the support of our trusted advisors. And we have April on the line with us today. She is our programming chair. Hi, April. With COVID-19, these certainly have been challenging times for all of us and the staff and of course all the families involved. We have found that these webinars have been a wonderful platform for us to connect together and to really discuss relevant issues with industry experts like we have on the line with us today. Our association has also been hosting a lot of online coffee chats. This is a platform where we're really able to have some face-to-face, real-time conversation, and it's just a really great way for our members to network. So please check out familybusinessatlantic.ca for a list of our upcoming webinars and a list of our upcoming coffee chats. So thanks for being with us here today. We encourage you to take advantage of all of Family Business Atlantic's offerings. So as you know, HR has been a very hot topic, which is why we are so pleased to have back with us for a second time HR professionals Ian Brown with Boyne Clark and Christine Eisner with Engage HR. They're going to be speaking about HR challenges and best practices we can use as we return back to the workplace. And they're here to answer any questions you have. Christine has been providing HR guidance to emerging small and medium-sized organizations in Atlantic Canada for more than 20 years. She deploys a scalable and flexible service model, common sense, and a good sense of humor to develop amazing people operations that founders, CEOs, and employees alike can all be proud of. Christine has a passion for working with people and for developing and for ensuring that an HR playbook is at hand to ensure that businesses run successfully. Now, Ian is a partner and the member of the business law team at Boyne Clark. He focuses on labor and employment law. Ian regularly advises clients on all matters related to the workplace, from the hiring process through to termination, including managing employees and employment agreements, human rights, employee absences, and all related matters that we're going to be speaking about today, again, to ensure that your businesses are running effectively as possible. So thank you both for joining us again for a second time. Before I hand it off, I just wanted to ask if those on the line today will be able to mute your microphone, but we want this to be an interactive webinar and make sure all your questions are being answered. So there is a chat feature at the bottom of the GoToMeeting control panel. Feel free to ask your questions in that chat room, and then maybe towards the end of the presentation, if anybody wants to unmute their mic and ask questions, we can do that as well. Well, thanks again, and I'm going to hand it off to our presenters.
Thank you. So Ian and I feel like we should take this on the road at this point. We've spent a couple of times on this forum having conversations as we all navigate the pandemic and just what the impact is to people's workforces, both from small, medium, and even large-size businesses, because we're all kind of experiencing things a little bit differently, but it's all the same experience that's has prevailed through COVID-19. So now we're at the point where businesses have been up and running and everybody's still kind of holding their breath for the big wave two. And I think that's what compels a lot of the conversations and hopefully a lot of the questions that the participants here will have. But in true fashion, Ian and I had a quick chat, and we've discovered that, yay, once again, we're on the same page with some of the questions that are coming up from our clients. So we're going to share, I think, a little bit of our wisdom and perhaps enlighten the folks on the line to know that they're not the only ones that may have issues, concerns, and questions with respect to COVID that are very similar to other businesses in Atlantic Canada as well. Does that about sum it up, Ian?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, it's funny because the talk, not funny, haha, interesting, I guess, that the talk started about this coming second wave midsummer, I would say, amongst my clients. And Nova Scotia, I was just looking at the numbers now, is still doing pretty good. And the bubble, I think, is doing pretty good. But we all have probably heard the news that other parts of Canada are heating up. And sometimes in news that they just simply talk about how Canada is heating up and they just ignore that the Atlantic provinces are doing okay. But, I had some concerns with kids going back to school. I have small kids, but my bigger concern was students coming from away and coming into the province and the potential there with the spread coming. And I think it's only a matter of time. So it's a very important time to talk about these and start turning your mind to the chance that things could heat up here a bit more than they have. We've enjoyed a little bit of a break over the summer.
Yeah, I think the one piece that we've talked about before, and I was a little sticky on my language, and I kept insisting that this is the new normal, not returning back to work, and that whole concept of going back. I mean, we'd love to believe that there's going to be a vaccine around the corner. We'd love to believe that at some point we're going to throw away these masks, and at some point we're going to be back where we started. But I think the reality is that this is our new normal. And probably one of the largest things that organizations can do is exhale a little bit with the holding their breath and waiting to see when we will return to business as usual, because this is business as usual. And it's a matter of having the right measures and metrics in place in order to navigate what we consider to be important elements of human resources, important elements of business strategies, et cetera, so that this becomes something that we become adaptable and flexible to. So to your point, Ian, when we hit a second wave, it's not a scramble like it was the first time. That we've had lessons learned, we've got the experience, we've got the business continuity in place, and we're able just to hopefully take a beat, prepare as we should, and get everyone to the place where they're just accepting what it is and being able to work in a way that's still effective and sustaining businesses throughout Atlantic Canada and Canada.
Yeah, I almost feel like what's happening right now is sort of the exhibition game or the trial run, because right now there's not a significant risk in Nova Scotia of the virus. It's the cases are quite low. We've got the procedures, hopefully your business, and hopefully you've adjusted to the procedures in place for now with masks and social distancing. It's important to learn from the lessons experienced in the spring, where you hope, if depending on the nature of the work that you do, maybe you transition a certain component, or maybe you can transitioned all of your work to remote work. And I can speak personally that the last time we did one of these, I was in my basement. Now I'm back at work. But there's a lot of new ways of doing things, and now's the time to kind of to work with that and work out the kinks, because I think it's inevitable as the fall comes and this flu season starts. There's going to be more concerns, and it may not be COVID. It may be a concern that someone gets the sniffles. Do they have COVID? Do they have the flu? What steps are you going to take to be ready, because you want to mitigate that risk within your workplace, and are you ready to deal with those sorts of things?
Yeah, great segue, Ian. One of the pieces that I'm seeing ramping up in my practice as I support my clients is that sense of business continuity and having a plan for business continuity. So, I mean, before when we talked, we were talking about, okay, how do we sustain the remote working conditions? How do we sustain a smaller workforce? A lot of the questions were with respect to, how do I lay somebody off? How do I keep in touch with that person that's laid off? How do I ensure that the people that I would like to bring back to work, how do I keep them warm or on the bench? And now that we're back into a business resumption, and we have all of our employees working and functioning in, as you say, in this trial run where we're kind of tentatively back to work, what happens in the event of a second wave? And we don't want to go back to everything shuts down and we've got a long runway, because we've got some learning and some lessons from it. So one of the things that I have been supporting businesses in doing is scenario testing. Most effectively just taking a look at the primary features of each business and saying, okay, from a workplace perspective, do you have everything set up? From a workforce perspective, do you have all the right procedures and elements in place? And from workplace, workforce, work plan perspective, do we have all the right supports and infrastructure in place? So to drill that down a little bit more, then you kind of create some scenarios as to what happens. So what happens in the event that you have an employee that tests positive for COVID? What happens in the event that you have an employee who is a near miss, so they are secondary to a spouse or a loved one or someone close in their sector, even a fellow colleague that they may work with outside of their own organization? What happens if they're exposed? And what can you do in that perspective? And then finally, what happens if we start to see the numbers increase? And that's very independent and it's very individual for each business. But having that plan in place, primary concern and focus should be that right now, so that everybody knows what to do in the event that we start to see the numbers spike, we start to see greater amount of community spread and exposure, and in the event that the province needs to make more extreme measures with reduction of workplaces again. One of the things that we have talked almost ad nauseum about, and I'm sure people are tired of hearing us say it, Ian, is communication is key. And it sounds so trite and it sounds so simple, but it has proven to be kind of the backbone to much of the success that organizations have had to really navigate through COVID. And that's one of the things, Ian, that you and I we kind of shake our heads like, yeah, it is really important. And you had mentioned something yesterday that I think is incredibly critical from a legal perspective with respect to what are you doing with the people that, I call them the drifters, like what are you doing with the people that haven't returned to work, don't want to, not sure that we want them to return to work, don't have quite the capacity. So, how do we handle those employees that we do in a way that's appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I'm seeing that this kind of fits a little more into the where we are right now phase, as opposed to where I think we may end up, because if we end up in a second wave and people are shutting down more, there may be more layoffs and those things we talked about in the spring, which we're happy to talk about again today and answer questions about what to do in the event that you do need to lay people off. But about those folks, I heard even in the news today that they were talking about how the economy is going to have a little spike because things picked up in the spring, and it's a little bit of a false sense of security, and Canadians aren't where they were with their earnings pre-COVID. And I see that a lot with my clients, where I see a lot of clients that have kind of been functioning with a skeleton crew. They've gotten what they need for the most part back. They've got a few employees that are kind of lingering, wondering if they're going to be recalled. And I also see it with employees coming to me for advice saying, I haven't been recalled yet, what's going on? And I think in terms of going forward, and Christine mentioned yesterday on the phone about this as well, how you handle this is very relevant to how your employees are going to see you now and in the future. And if, in my personal opinion, if you are at the point where you know that you don't need an employee back, it's not good practice to kind of string them along and hope they go away. On the employment law side, if an employee quits and leaves and moves on, the employer doesn't really have any liability for that. And I see circumstances where I think that that's maybe the battle plan, or maybe it's kind of, they just don't want to make that judgment call. But the longer that drags on, it sows discontent. It may, and the employees are talking. I hear very often that employees that are laid off, they're getting together and they're talking about what's happening, who's been recalled, who hasn't, and how the communication is. And This, I think, can have a long-term impact on your morale and your employees' view of your workplace. So, in my personal opinion, it if you don't need them, you should really turn your mind to ending the employment relationship, dealing with the severance, and getting that taken care of. And employers owe employees a duty of good faith in the manner of termination. And I don't, there hasn't been any cases on this, but there may be in the future, as because the legal system doesn't move very quickly. But if an employer rather knows that they didn't need the employee and they were just stringing them along, that's not going to look good if it comes out in a case.
Yeah. And one thing, Ian, if you could just mention, because I know under the Emergency Act, there's some elements of employment and employee relations that have been somewhat, I don't want to say discarded, but they've definitely been modified with notice periods, et cetera, and what the responsibilities are on behalf of employers. But can you talk a little bit about what still stands stands the test of time, regardless of the Emergency Act being enforced?
So that's a great question. We talked about that a little bit yesterday. So thanks for that. The other part of that waiting to see what happens with employees, if I see a lot of employers, I think, operating under the assumption that when they laid off a bunch of folks in March temporarily, that because we're still under COVID, they can still take advantage of some of the, let's say, angles or provisions that they took advantage of them. One of them being in the Labor Standards Code, which governs the minimum notice requirements for provincially regulated employees in Nova Scotia. Employers where there's an emergency or an act beyond their control, i.e. a government shutdown, they don't have to give the employees notice, and that can be an excuse from giving the notice under the code. That also can be an excuse for reinstating a long-term employee, but the situation we were in March is different now. And the fact that your business is down now because of COVID may not meet the same test that it did in the spring when your business couldn't operate because the government shut it down. So I think there's a little bit of false sense of security about what the employer's rights are, and it shouldn't be lost in the shuffle here that the statutory requirements are the minimums. And the fact that the Labor Standards Code has an exception that you might get out of giving notice under the Labor Standards Code doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get out of your common law notice obligations to your employees. That's a different test, and it's a bit of a higher bar. So I think employers, especially right now where Nova Scotia's cases are low and business is doing a little better than it used to be, if they are laying people off, they have to be very careful about their obligations in that circumstance.
Yeah, that's sage advice. I see that a little bit with my kind of with my circle that I talk to. There's a bit there for those employers that want to do the best transition for themselves and for their employees. They're asking the right questions, and for others that really are seeing, a diminished bottom line as a result of COVID or reduction or retraction of their workforce, it gets really confusing because you in some cases you're not sure whether you're going to need those employees again. You're not sure whether or not you can afford those employees again. You're not sure what to do with those employees. In some cases, you can't afford to perhaps pay for severance as you would under normal conditions. But I think it's really, really critical to understand what your requirements and your obligations are with respect to layoff. And as we talked about, it's time to really consider that long goodbye as to whether or not it's appropriate anymore. Laying somebody off versus making a sound decision and letting them go forward and move on to another employment opportunity. In other words, a straight up termination is the conversation that I think many employers need to be having at this point. And we talked a little bit about that, Ian, that, you said that employees talk. Social media is an amazing it's an amazing tool in a lot of cases. And, employees are not, their employees and future employees are very savvy. They have certain places that they have certain criteria that they look for when they choose employers to apply to work with. And one of the biggest things that's come out of COVID is this monumental sense of trust. So the employment relationship previous to COVID, I would say, was almost a little slanted in the sense that, employers dispense performance management, employers dispense benefits, employers dispense their communication strategies, and great employers would do this with their employees, not to their employees. But it was very much a top-down approach. Things would be developed in a way that it was suitable for the employer to gain the performance metrics and gain the performance and the productivity in the employees. What's happened now with COVID is the idea that an employee is a very savvy. They're savvy in who they choose to work with. The importance in the medium of social media and how employers have acted throughout COVID has influenced a lot of where employers will stay, where they will go, and who they want to work with. So, in the interest of communication and transparency, that's key. But this sense of trust, and that in a lot of cases has been such a wild card that's happened because trust between employer and employees is critical. So ensuring that you're transitioning your employees, that you should be transitioning at the right time, is key. Communicating with your employees that exist, both what your continuity plan is, what your objectives are, anything that you feel is relevant for an employee to understand and be able to adapt with the organization is fundamental. And we may have talked about that more in HR circles. We may have talked about that as, oh, that's a best practice. I think it's an essential practice at this point too. Employees are going to talk on social media about how they were treated during COVID, whether or not they remain with an organization or they transition, they will talk. But more importantly, like this sense of adaptability where we're in the bubble, we're quarantined, we're still in a smaller bubble, but we're not in quarantine. We've got to move the business forward. We may have to retract the business. We may be working in our business offices. We may need to return to a remote or at distance. If you don't have that sense of transparency in your communication, if you don't have that sense of trust with your employees, it's going to be a long and a hard ride. So, part of that is, sorry, go ahead, Ian.
I just want to add one thing in there too, and we touched on this a little bit, but the situation, of course, right now, although we hear the news about the wave coming, the situation where we're right now in Nova Scotia, where the cases are low and there's a little bit of a false sense of security, is a very different situation than we were in March. And I don't know if I'm naive in saying this, but I think there was a certain amount of understanding from employees in March that businesses were caught in a situation beyond their control. They were ordered to shut down, and there was really nothing they could do at the time. As those restrictions have been lifted, and as those businesses have returned to some semblance of normal, and we hear about certain parts of the economy that are doing quite well, the employees' patience, I think, in that regard, is becoming less and less. And I think that goes to Christine's point about the trust, because the situation now is quite different. It might change again when if a second wave comes here, but the employees are not going to really believe as much that the employer can't bring them back. It may just be that the employer doesn't want to bring them back.
Yeah. So, we've said this before, and it's really critical. You as an employer can shape and form and get in front of the message that you want to communicate, or you can be playing kind of catch up and damage control. If we have employees that are on the phone or on social media and they're talking about what's happening with them, in a lot of cases you get into damage control mode, and there's no need for it. One of the things, and this is anything that, the secret sauce with human resources, I would say, is, you communicate, because, sometimes no good deed goes unpunished, and you think you're being kind to your employees right now and saying, we're not sure if we can bring them back, so we're not going to say anything to those that continue to be laid off. And in the absence of having actual information from the source, people will make up their own minds. And, this has been a time of a tremendous amount of uncertainty. that message could get away from you. You could lose very talented employees, or you can have people feeling very disconnected from their employers, and either moving on their own, or even worse, not moving on, not knowing what their status is, and could potentially have some significant grievance in the future that could come back and bite an employer, all for the sake that they could have just had a conversation.
And I also believe, and this is of course anecdotal, but in my view, I think a lot of the times, if you can get ahead of that narrative, you can communicate with your employee, and even if it is the bad news, and you give them the bad news, if you're bringing it to them as opposed to waiting for them to bring it to a head, it may actually help you in the negotiations. If you have an employee on the other side that really just feels, well, this isn't my fault, it is what it is, that's unfortunate, they're going to have a different attitude if you end up in a conflict negotiating severance or things like that. They're going to, of course, no one likes to be let go, but I think it's going to be a very different narrative if there was no communication, a whole bunch of employees were brought back, it really just looked like the employer was trying to ignore them if they go away, the employee brings it ahead and brings a claim, then they're going to be looking for a pound of flesh. And that's going to be a harder situation to negotiate. So there's a financial advantage, in my opinion, of getting ahead of these and trying to control that narrative, because once you have someone who feels that they've been wronged, it's a lot harder to kind of get that situation smoothed over and dealt with than if they feel that it is what it is. It's just that this is beyond anyone's fault and they just want to be treated fairly.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And again, it's I mean, this is the one thing that we have been seeing over and over again. It's open transparency, and one of the biggest pieces that you can do with your existing employees, so those that have been returned or have been sustained with the organization throughout COVID. Leadership has been a fundamental factor, and one of the largest things that many organizations are seeing is leadership is coming from a wide swath of direction. It's not always from the top. And the lesson to take from that too is this is something that you do with your employees, not to your employees. Navigating change, adaptability, performance, all of those things, they have to be something that starts to provide some opportunity for employees to see where they continuously engage with their employer. And more simply put, like, people have to see the value of their worth. They have to see the value of their effort when it comes to work. That's one of, if you look at Gallup's 12 questions, one of the fundamental things that they talk about is people stay productive and engaged in the workforce if they feel that their efforts are an immediate contribution to the success of the company. That couldn't be any more true right now. So we have folks that are probably very uncertain about whether or not they have been recalled, if they will continue to maintain their job in the event of a second wave. We have some employees who are now at distance. We have many employees seeing many of the folks that they work with that have either been laid off or haven't been returned, and most likely every single day wondering whether or not they're going to be next, or what the threshold will be if the company will be sustained. So having that connection, not only to the communication and making sure that that communication is active, it's incredibly fundamental at this point for folks to know that the work that they do every single day, whether it's at home, whether it's in the office, whether it's changed from their original job description, what have you, is still making a very immediate contribution to the workforce. So that plays out in several different ways. That's your communication strategy, that's your performance planning, et cetera. But on the back end, for the benefit to the employer, it's a very easy way to really start to ensure that the work that is being conducted, the productivity is focused. It's a very easy conversation to say, look, this is about our collective sustainability. The work that you need to do and the work that is important to the organization might be different from the work that you needed to do, or what you used to do, but this is incredibly valuable. And that's that beyond any HR practice, beyond any performance management program, anything else, those live and active feedback discussions with your employees to let them know that what they're doing is vital to the success of the organization is probably the easiest and most effective way to really connect and establish that transparent communication, establish that trust, and really kind of keep people focused on the right things to keep your business moving forward. You're on mute. There you go.
Talking with my microphone off. Yeah, great point. And I want to just take a minute to circle back to, because that's where we are now, and just to talk, I guess, a little bit about where we are going. And you made some great points about getting ready and having that communication plan with your employees so they kind of understand where the goalposts are, what they've been doing in terms of social distancing and mask requirements and work from home and policies and those sorts of things going forward. I wanted to throw another couple points in there because it's not just an issue of whether or not COVID comes into your workplace or whether or not someone is sick and you have to be very careful because there are layers. Layers being, of course, first and foremost, under occupational health and safety, you have an obligation to provide a safe work environment for your employees. So you can't have people there that you think might spread the virus, let alone the possible risk that might have on your business financially. But also the concerns about those employees that I guess I have two concerns that I'd like to talk about with Christine. One, I want to flag those who can't come in because their kids are home. And then secondly, those who might see an opportunity here to get some more sick days. So the first one is to not lose track of that. There'll be times, I mean, if anyone has kids, you'll know that they get sick a lot. And when they go to school, the colds go around. And there's going to be times where, as a precaution, those employees are going to self-isolate well, firstly, their kids may not be able to go to school and the kids aren't going to be able to go to daycare because they're showing these symptoms. So they're going to have to be home and the parents are going to have to be home with them. And there is an obligation to workplaces, even if those employees don't have sick days per se, because Nova Scotia only gives us 3 unpaid sick days. There's an obligation on human rights to accommodate family status. And we can't lose sight of that because your workplace will have to be ready for additional absences as a result of this coming storm of folks that have to stay home with the kids. And if there's any way to have those folks still be productive, doing some work from home, things like that, that's something to really turn your minds to now because it's going to happen. And your business will have to work with them up to undue hardship, which is a difficult measure. If you have one employee, maybe it's undue hardship if that one employee can't come in because of their family status situation. But if you've got 24 or 50 or 300, it's a very different equation. So I wanted to flag that. And then secondly, I wanted to kind of flag the concerns that are ongoing in my practice where I hear often of people what I call Friday, Monday-itis, who happen to be sick on these sorts of days. And the advice I give to employers is to track the folks that are taking these days carefully and keep an eye on those in a new environment because you're going to have folks that are going to want to take advantage of this situation to get some more days off. And then the third one, just before you go run with this, Christine, is, and don't forget in Nova Scotia that there's a human rights protection for irrational fear of contracting a disease. And as things pick up again, you will also have folks that are very afraid to come into work because of COVID. You may have experienced this already. You're going to have to work with that to a certain extent. And that's where I circle back to saying if there's any way you can accommodate remote work, that might help with that. And I'll turn it over to you, Christine.
Oh, awesome points. I think, you know what, I think we're already starting to see this. So for those of you who had kids in HRM last week with the Hurricane Teddy, you want to see some blank faces in my house. It went something like this. Well, they're probably going to cancel school tomorrow. Yeah, well, did they set up a Zoom call or something on Google Classrooms? And I got the blank face. I'm like, well, there's no reason why they couldn't have conducted school remotely. I'm sure that standing that up from from an educational perspective isn't easy, but the look on my kids' faces was just like, oh, that's true. So, the impending snow days that everybody's like, woohoo, no school, that might change when we start getting into the season if we do see either, we see a reduction in our business environments and schools all of a sudden go back to being remote. So it was an interesting observation because we've all proven in many cases that we can be very flexible. We can be very nimble to work at distance. So to your point, Ian, exhausting undue hardship with one employee is very, very different than 24. One of the things that I wrote down here, and we talked about this last time about what HR policies need to be reviewed, those that might be updated as a result of COVID with regard to health and safety, your joint occupational health and safety, the mandate that they need to review with respect to higher levels of sanitation, et cetera, in the workforce. Your sick days, vacation days, performance planning, all of those things that we talked about last time. The thing that's flagged for me right now is progressive discipline programs and policies in the workplace. So, and Ian, you can piggyback on what I'm about to say. If you have a progressive discipline procedure, and if it's like a 3-strike rule where you've got a verbal, a written, and a final notice, and then you move to termination, what's going to be really critical when Ian says, you have to observe the Monday, Friday itis, etc. There is still a responsibility on behalf of the employer to adhere to whatever policies that they have in place. So if you're looking at your progressive discipline program or your policy, it's going to be really critical that you put the COVID lens on it and that it's actually written out in a way that will enable you to manage those cases that you feel that people are exasperating good faith or they're, definitely it becomes more of a disciplinary issue as opposed to perhaps you do have somebody who, really is able to work from home. You can set that up and you can still have that person working productively. So there's going to be a little bit more definition, I think, between those cases. And I've dealt with them over the years of somebody who, may be not sick, that is, has an increased level of absenteeism, who is not as engaged in their productive workplace, et cetera, et cetera. There's an opportunity to be really, really critical to manage those cases that you think are being abusive, but also have a little bit wider berth for those cases that you can say, okay, you've got kids that have kids that have needs at home. You are required to be home because of childcare or because school is closed or what have you. So I'm rambling a bit here, but I guess my only thought on that is make sure that what you do have in place, you are still able to enforce and to manage, but that process is exclusive to those that you feel are abusive to the sick days or the absenteeism versus those that you would want to make accommodation for. Because, and Ian, you can speak to this, this is when it gets hairy from an HR and from a legal perspective if it's applied subjectively as opposed to consistently as far as a practice.
Yeah, that's kind of the catch-22 on this, because I'm going to tell you to be rigid, but also tell you to be flexible. And that's sort of what Christine was saying. You have to follow. You can't just randomly apply your policy to random different people when you feel like it. If there's that inconsistency, not only is it a bad idea for having your employees not know what to expect and what they shouldn't do, but also from a legal perspective, if you try to take a hard line on a policy that you didn't take a hard line on, it's going to be a lot more challenging to stand behind that. But at the same time, you have to take a hard line within the confines of the law. So taking a hard line on a policy against somebody that then unintentionally or adversely affects that employee's human rights is a problem. So there has to be a lens in which you look through this to be careful in COVID and to be careful with human rights, family status obligation, and things like that, to make sure that you're not inadvertently crossing a boundary you shouldn't be. Another point I'll throw in there Also is, and this is just general and with respect to these sorts of policies, employers like three strikes you're out policies, but employers often come to me with, well, they were sick on a Friday, they were late on a Thursday, and they did, I don't know, something in the kitchen on another. They're all unrelated, and that's a problem too, because the court looks at progressive discipline where the employee has been given a goal or a task. They haven't met that sort of standard. They're told why they haven't met it, and then they're given the tools to meet it, and then they don't. And then when they don't, they're told, and those goals have to be clear and reasonable. And then when they don't, they're told, okay, well, we're still working with you, but you need to understand that if you don't meet this standard or do this by a certain deadline, you could be subject to discipline up including termination. So they need to know that if they don't correct their behavior, they're going to lose their job. And if that's clearly communicated to the employee and they failed to meet the standard and they got a couple chances, then probably you're fine in terms of establishing cause and a termination. But that takes time, effort, and patience. And I can tell you that often employers fall short on that. So good to be very
Yeah.
careful about that.
Yeah, so I mean, normally what I see as the normal life cycle of something like that, Ian, is you have an employee that a manager would say, you know what, they were sick on a Thursday, and then they were sick on a Tuesday, then they were sick on a Friday, and you have several cases before you get to the point where a supervisor or a manager wants to deal with it, because up until a certain point, they're willing to be flexible. They're willing to work with the employee. So there's usually a couple of incidents that pass that are not managed, and then you get to a point where the supervisor manager has had enough and wants to start to apply that discipline. Then all of a sudden, you want to apply the discipline to each and every single incident. And as you said, there's not enough time horizon, or there's not enough communication so that the employee has to understand, okay, you got to pick up your socks. This has got to be managed. You got to get to a place where you're able to have a sustained change, positive change to the problem area or the problem behavior. And I see that a lot, where we get to the point where you've got supervisors with their hands thrown up in the air and going, I can't rely on this employee, et cetera. So having the patience in the beginning is okay, but I always say begin as you mean to continue. So if you're going to let 2 or 3 absences happen before you're going to take issue with them, you can't then change the rules and try to manage every single individual incident. So progressive discipline really does need to be, from a policy perspective, it needs to reflect truly what's going to happen, to your point, Ian, so that there's no ambiguity and there's no misapplication of the policy, so that employees are surprised. Termination should never be a surprise to an employee, ever. And the litmus test that I always use internally before folks go in and chat with you is, have we given them enough opportunity to make a change? Perhaps something that you can speak to, Ian, is if you have someone who needs to, prior to COVID, would need to have appropriate daycare, appropriate supports in place in order to manage a schedule, and they've done so. What does an employee need to do in order to ensure that they are doing their very best to attend work, to maintain their schedule, be work on time, etc., in the ambiguity of either not having daycare, etc., so that folks have a better idea of when we get to that point where it's undue hardship, or we've exhausted the employment relationship. Like, what conditions do you normally look at and say, okay, the employer had a right at that point to move to a termination that would be supported?
That's a tough one, because it truly is case by case. There has to be. I mean, that depends on the nature of the work. It depends on the size of the workplace. There has to be a dialogue, in my view, between the employer and the employee, a good communication about what's needed, and it may be that simply let's have to make an easy one. Maybe you've got a widget factory and the person has to be there making the widgets, and they can't be there making the widgets because they have to be home with the kids. Um, in that case, maybe the solution is it's not maybe not necessarily a termination, because you need to know whether or not this childcare is a permanent issue. I mean, if it's a permanent issue that this I don't know how it would be a permanent issue that they would never have childcare, because it seems to be a moving target, and we experienced this a bit in the spring. But in my view, it's I would prefer an employer to go an unpaid leave route pending the completion of the childcare, and then working out whether or not the employee is working with you. Because if it appears that the employee is pushing back, I saw this happen in the spring where employees were unserved or in the summer, and they're sure there was a childcare issue, but at the same time, there's kind of a question of you thinking, well, maybe they just kind of like being off for the summer. There has to be kind of a little bit of pushback from the employer, and maybe some deadlines and some good communication to kind of sort out whether or not it appears the employee is genuinely in a situation that they just unfortunately don't have a quick solution, or whether or not it appears it might be culpable. And if it appears it might be culpable and the evidence starts to show, then maybe we might move to a termination. But if it's just too gray, it might be just, okay, unpaid leave, just wait on that one and see what you can do with your other employees in the meantime, because it is truly a minefield and you don't necessarily want to go down that route. I do want to make one more point about progressive discipline and termination. There may be some employees that simply don't appear to be salvageable, and it doesn't seem to make sense to go down the progressive route for certain things. Of course, the goal should be to keep that employee working with you, because I'm sure that's cheaper than having to go out and find a new one. But sometimes you want to explore whether or not you simply want to do a without cause termination, without going down the progressive discipline minefield, especially in light of COVID and human rights and all that sort of stuff, because that may be much cleaner than trying to assert cause. And I did want to make one more point on my comments about Friday, Monday-itis, because I don't want those to be taken out of context. If you have an employee that's sick on Friday, sick on Monday, and sick on the next Friday, and say, okay, now I want to fire them, that's not how you do it.
No.
It's important to watch those trends. And if you see a pattern developing, there are procedural fairness obligations, and to satisfy human rights duties to inquire, it's important to sit down with that employee or do a Zoom conversation or whatever the way is to approach the employer, put the information to them, and give them an opportunity to respond and explain themselves. Because it may be that they have a legitimate explanation. Well, I was absent 3 Fridays because my child had appointments to see a specialist that's only available on Fridays. I mean, and then that makes sense. And you won't know until you confront the employee on it. But if you see a pattern, then you put it to the employee, and then you can emphasize to them that these absences are hasn't been a clear justification this, and that going forward they need to be very careful about that, and kind of set the goals and go from there.
Yeah, all good points, Ian. You know what, we keep coming back to the same points, and it's like pulling the curtain back on Oz in some cases, but it really is about settling into some of those uncomfortable conversations that need to have, that just save so much time, energy, effort, and money at the end of the day. So, being very, again, to put the kind of the COVID lens on this, it is really, really important for organizations at this point just to make sure that the policies and the practices that they have in place are going to help sustain and support them in times that are uncertain like this. That are flexible and nimble enough so that it can accommodate for at distance. We didn't really touch on a whole lot of the at distance piece as it will pertain in wave 2, but I think a lot of it just comes from, settling into what are the right conversations to have. What is that business continuity piece? And the other thing I just want to mention too is that we talked a little bit about leadership, and what's really critical at this point is, innovation and great ideas are not coming always from the top of your organization. Sometimes the best solutions, either for a duty to accommodate or for flexing a work schedule or for working at distance, etc. Some of those come from the people that are closest to the work themselves. So when you open up those conversations, whether it's from a performance piece or progressive discipline concern or what have you, when you actually do sit down and have a conversation with your employee, not only do you get enlightened with what, the potential backstory is that you might be able to accommodate, but the other piece is too, there are a lot of solutions out there, and some of them we, as in our own lens, we may not be able to find. But I can guarantee you right now, as CERB is starting to draw to a close, as employees are concerned about what potentially could happen with organizations that, are struggling for this year to be sustained, they really want to have that sense of security that perhaps they didn't have in their, that perhaps they had before COVID in their employment. So again, going back to that point about it not being something that we do to our employees, but with them, opening that communication in any circumstance as a first step, I think is going to serve you well. It's going to serve you well if you have to support your decisions in more of a legal forum. It's important, to have those conversations, to support it with your existing employees and building that trust. All of this just comes from really solid practices and doing the right thing. And we've said this before, and it really is like follow your instincts and the common sense rule of if it might be an uncomfortable conversation that you need to have, whether it's about layoff or change in job or reduction in work hours or termination or whatever it is. But you can be guaranteed that if you go in it with the sense that you're trying to be fair and genuine and consistent with the individual you're having the conversation with, it's probably going to save you a significant headache and heartache and bill at the end of the day. So your key elements really are starting right from the very beginning with an appropriate conversation. Ian, what else would you like to say? And maybe we can, in the last 10 minutes, we can open it up for any questions that folks have.
No, I agree everything that you said, and I was thinking we probably should leave a little room for questions here. I mean, I honestly don't believe that fundamentally in the world of employment law that the toolkit has changed much through this. I had to turn my mind to certain provisions of certain acts that I hadn't had to deal with previously. But in the end, it all comes down to what we talked about, which is trying to get ahead of the narrative, having good communication, and just trying to get ahead of those issues before they spiral out of control. And that comes down to everybody kind of knowing as best they can how to react to this uncertain environment. So let's see if anyone has. Oh, there's a question there. Any sense of how many have lost their jobs in Atlantic Canada? I do not know the answer to that question.
Neither do I. Michelle's asking that one. That's a tough one. And again, I mean, the CERB numbers, I know that when it comes to those that are on unemployment or on CERB, the numbers in the midst of COVID were the same as they were spiking, I think about 0.2 or 0.3% higher for unemployment rates as it did in our highest peak, which would have been, oh God, would that have been for the 80s, I think. So I think it was 13.5, 13.7% unemployment, but that was Canada. So I'm not certain of the numbers here in Nova Scotia.
Yeah, I think it was definitely devastating in the spring and started to improve a little bit over the summer. And I think the CERB kind of gave a bit of a false sense of security. And there's a question going forward with that transitioning to EI and a lot of debts coming due that things are going to get worse before they get better. But yeah, I don't know for sure. Does anyone have any questions about anything we've been talking about today?
Well, I think you covered a lot of, there we have someone a question.
Oh, just trying to get a sense of how companies have responded and if their number of employees have reduced. I would suggest the trend without putting any quantifiable percentages or facts around this. My sense, Michelle, is that most organizations have had an opportunity to take a deep seat, do an organizational review, and I hate to use the word restructure, but I think there's been a lot of hard questions about the workforce reductions. Even if it's one or two people, I think there's been enough transformation at this point to say that it's a fair statement to say that there has been workforce reductions. I just don't know what the percentages are.
Yeah, I've seen it too.
Yeah, and CFIB has a number of reports. I'm just looking at one right now. I think you can go to their dashboard at smallbusinesseveryday.ca/dashboard. As of September 2nd, this is Canadian only. There's likely some reporting on Atlantic Canada as well. Canadian small business, only 64% are fully open, 41% are fully staffed, and only 28% are at their normal sales.
Wow.
I also suspect there's a percentage of businesses that have found a more streamlined way to operate out of this that they didn't expect, and accommodated new things like remote work that they probably hadn't turned their mind to before, and now find themselves kind of in the situation where now they've got a good system going, but they don't need all those folks back. And that's what I've been, I've been hearing some of those situations of, okay, and it's for lack of a better expression, they've kind of trimmed the fat. They're running kind of well now, and now they have to deal with the folks that maybe they don't need anymore.
Yeah, and the other piece that's coming out of that too is because sometimes the delivery of the product or service is so different that they've had to do a workforce reduction because the skill set that they now need going forward is very different than the skill set they had before. So that organizational review is sometimes a workforce reduction, or sometimes it's going to turn into a transformation of what skills need to be on board.
Yep.
On that topic, hello. Could you just touch on constructive dismissal if someone's job significantly changes?
Happy to.
Yeah, we have a case right now. Just what you spoke about is our business has significantly changed. Not significantly, if we've lost certain departments, and so one person's job is changing. So I need to document a letter about how this person's job will change. So could you just touch on that?
So I'll talk generally on constructive dismissal, and the way the case law has kind of gone in Nova Scotia for the most part is the biggest concern is a reduction in basically the pay of the employee. Yes, constructive dismissal can be a demotion simply in terms of status and in terms of duties, even reporting duties. But our legal system kind of works off of what your loss was. And whether or not the position was intolerable and the effect on the employee. The example I used to give here, no offense to our folks that work down in the mailroom, but I'm a lawyer, and they said, Ian, you're a nice guy. Going forward, you're going to work in the mailroom, and we're going to pay what we pay the people in the mailroom. That's a drop in status, but the big thing is that would be a drop in income. So I can say that's not what I signed up for. You fundamentally changed my job, so I'm going to sue for my notice period. Where that becomes more challenging is when a company says, we're going to change duties A, B, and C, but we're not going to change your income. And then it's kind of on the employee to go, okay, well, now I'm going to quit my job and sue you and claim my damages. And then it's the employee's burden. So it's a high bar, but I always counsel employers to be very careful about that. Again, communication is key. And it also helps if you can give notice, because a way to mitigate that change in duties is to give notice. And it may be that you say, effective 2 months from now, we're changing your duties to be A, B, C, and D, and your new salary will be X, which happens to be lower than your last one, but we're going to top you up for a certain period of time. And that may be commensurate to what the notice period might be, or what an educated guess of how willing they are to kind of fight with you. And that might help to mitigate that claim. So it is kind of case by case. You have to be aware of it, but you have management rights to kind of change duties to a certain extent without fundamentally changing the job. And if you're not changing their income, then there's probably not going to be a constructive dismissal. The key is just to give some advance notice if you can.
That's excellent advice. I never realized that the compensation piece was so strong on that. So thank you.
Oh, it's huge.
Well, thank you very much, Christine and Ian. This was very informative. Some of the key points that I heard over and over was just how critically important communication is, even when it is a difficult conversation. Because I think, you know, a lot of the issues that people run into, I suspect, are because there may be a team of disengaged employees. And so how you engage people, of course, is through communication, but also how do they know that they're contributing? I heard that as well, which if they don't feel like they're contributing or they can't see if they're winning or not, then they become disengaged, and then you may find yourself with more, you know, Friday, Monday, Saturday, and so on. But anyway, I really enjoyed that conversation. Thank you very much again for all your sage advice. Great to see you both.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
It was fun. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you, Christine. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having us.